returned after clearing the SD card because I have too many pictures of cats. Anyway, DMZ, Rhineland, yada 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 yada. Okay, Treaty of Versailles, and this is a direct quote from the movie, documentary. Inflation makes clever financiers rich to cancel the debts of the landowners. And I thought inflation was due to the fact that they had to pay $281 billion in war, plus accept the guilt, well, not the guilt, you don't have to pay for guilt in money, and then reparations to the other nations. I don't know how much they charged. I looked it up. That's over $3 trillion today in reparations in 1918. That's a lot of money. Any country's inflation would probably go up. And at this point, inflation reached, I think, 100 billion marks an egg. Something ridiculous like that. Look up inflation. Germany, 1923. It's nuts. Pay off the debts of the rich landowners, and Carl Schmid lost his job in the Depression. And I'm like, whoa, the Depression. How did we get into the Depression? We were in 25, and now we're in 29? But yeah, the Depression did cause a lot of jobs to be lost, although I read that 3 out of 10 Germans had full-time jobs, and 3 out of 10 Germans had no jobs whatsoever, and then the other 4 had part-time employment, so I don't know what that would count as. So 30% unemployed with 40% half employed. It's probably not a good way to have a lot of money in the economy if many people are unemployed. Yada yada yada. Canceled debts, cost his job. Once again, Carl Schmid was taught to hate because the teachers of the old republic had been left in power. Yes, I'm sure it was the teachers that taught Carl Schmid to hate, and the fact that he was starving, had no money, and had to deal with the fact that his nation was beaten. Although that being said, it did make a slightly good point on the fact that there weren't any armies coming in, so people could have assumed that they weren't beaten, but I'm going to assume, which is probably a bad thing, never assume, I'm going to speculate, that's better, that the German people were angry by the fact that they were starving, and that there was no money. Well, actually, that wasn't the problem, that there was no money, it was that there was too much money. Too much money, not worth anything. And Treaty of Versailles, and then it goes on to talk about how the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. refused to sign it, and how we refused to join the UN. Sorry, proto-UN of the League of Nations, and how the Germans, how we pulled out, the Americans pulled out of the invaded areas after 9 months, and how the British pulled out of their controlled area after 5 years, which I believe was what they were supposed to do after the Treaty of Versailles, after repeated violations of the treaty on the Germans' half. This would put them at 1924 to 1925. I don't know what violations this movie is representing, except the tank trials that are taking place in secret in Russia on behest of the German army. Again, the German political system had gone so far crazy, as it was more like a warlord situation where you had different political parties and army units controlling random things and doing different things. Again, I got distracted. And then it talks about how Germany violated the treaty. That was 1924 to 1925. Again, the Russian tank movements that were a joint effort between the Germans using old World War I German tanks that had been sold to Sweden or Norway and then bought back by Germans. And then the inability to pay the reparations in an inflation economy. And then it talks about the quote, the Frenches made one final attempt to enforce the Treaty of Versailles and marched into the Ruhr. I heard that was because they weren't getting their money from the Treaty of Versailles, Also, they disarmed the police in there. It was a military action. I don't think they were supposed to be there. And after a German blew up a German train track, the French held a tribunal and shot him. I don't think that was in the Treaty of Versailles. They made them... Okay, this made them so sound unpopular in a world drenched in German propaganda. I think that's universal. You go into another nation because they're not paying you money that you demanded from a war. That in the treaty they had absolutely no say in. That's another thing. Sorry, tangent. Treaty of Versailles. No Germans were allowed to negotiate on the behalf of their country for the amount of money that could be negotiated over the certain amount of years. The Treaty of Versailles was done, and then the Allies said, here's the package deal, take it or leave it. And the French and the British were blockading Germany from receiving imports, despite the fact that Herbert Hoover was willing and able to send American aid. The French and Brits are like, no. We starved them, they signed the treaty, then they can get their food and aid, which eventually did happen. The Germans did sign, but it wasn't added. Now, where was I? I've completely lost where I am on this tangent. Treaty of Versailles made them so about German propaganda, and then it goes on to talk about how there could have been no invasion of the Soviet Union. Only mention of the Soviet Union, by the way, with a 100,000-man army. There couldn't have been tax on merchant ships if there had been no submarines had the Treaty of Versailles been kept. There couldn't have been invasions of Poland or France had the Rhineland been kept demilitarized. I debate that. It would have been more difficult. Or it might have been impossible. I never know. Read Heinz Guderian. Title. Area. Yeah. Good stuff. Good books. World War history. So it goes on this tangent for a while, and the fact that nobody enforced the League of Nations or the Treaty of Versailles. And then finally, Germans... the German leaders were whining about the fact that they were being economically crushed. Now at this time they're talking about the German leaders of the Werner Republic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And then it showed a few clips of the German leader Sprecht, and another one I don't remember, talking about how their country was being crushed economically by the Treaty of Versailles and that the Allies were being too harsh. And then that they didn't have any money to pay. They believed this, and then the Nazis rise to power. And in the mention of the Nazis' rise to power, they merely mentioned that the landowners, the chief of staff, the industrialists, the state officers, they all found in Hitler the one person they needed, and it made it seem like there was this cabal of Germans working together for the purpose of replacing it and getting back to Germany, which I guess to a certain extent the German army that was left could technically be guilty of that or accused of that. But they had nothing to do with Hitler, and Hitler was fired from the army, was recruited by the Nationalist Socialists of, I forget where, which there were a few National Socialists around in Bavaria. Mentioned nothing of the beer hall push, so it made it seem like thanks to this German cabal, it just rose to the top, and whoa, we have Hitler's chancellor, yay! Burned down the federal building, which I can't remember the name of, and blame it on the communists. Very simple. Communist revolutions had been happening since the war. Some of it had been funded by the Russians, and ironically enough, something I learned, there were commie Jews. That was a thing. I did not know this. I was fascinated by that. Does that mean that they were the rule? No, they were the exception. I do not condone holocausts. Yada 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 yada. Rise of power. No mention of the beer hall push, nor the cap push, nor the issue Oh, dang it. Sorry. Rewind back. I'm jumping back in time here. The talking about how the Americans pulled out after 9 months. Something I learned from the Russia and the West under Lenin and Stalin is that America had some bigger issues to deal with, mainly the fact that during the war they had gotten involved with Russian ports, that the Brits and the French were trying to open up a second front again in the east after the Brest-Litovsk Treaty by using the ports of Archangel and another one. I don't know the name of it. And they were there to 1921 or 22. Long after the war with Germany was signed, they were still fighting Bolsheviks. This was almost the entire length of the Russian Civil War, now that I think about it. And that there were Czechoslovakians on the Trans-Siberian Railroad that were trying to walk across or get a train ride across Russia to get back to Port Arthur, where they could hitch a ride to America, which then they could hitch a ride to Europe to get back on the fight. They never did, but they ended up taking a lot of territory along the Trans-Siberian Railroad under their control, which then led to an invasion of Port Arthur between the Allies, the British, the Americans and the Japanese. The Japanese wanted to stay to expand their goals. Japanese Empire, that thing. And they also stayed there until 1921 or 22, I think. Research. Yeah. So no mention of that. Going back forward in time. Hitler's chancellor. How convenient. And that the re-preaching of the hate that was in the German psyche of racial superiority and German supremacy. And then it talks about the war and World War II. World War II stuff. It doesn't really go into that. And then it goes to after the World War, at which point it talks about the differences of how the German industry was left untouched somewhat in the First World War, whereas in the Second World War it was completely destroyed and under the regulation of Allied troops. And it continues mentioning all the differences of how the German leaders from the First World War were pretty much left untouched, and how the German leaders in the Second World War were tried for military crimes, and for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and shot, or hung, or both. And it continues going on that. And then it finally mentions that Carl Schmid must rid himself of militarism, and of the memory and history of Frederick the Great, Otto von Bismarck, and the Kaiser Wilhelm II. If he is to take, if not, he is a threat to civilization, direct quote. Only when he does can he take his place in the society of man. This could just be an issue of 1940s word arrangements, but I'm thinking, yeesh, I have to give up my history just so I can do trade and be considered not a threat or a rogue nation? Ugh. I mean, imagine what would happen if Britain was told you have to give up all your history because you invaded half the world, or a quarter of the world. I forget how much the British Empire owned. I doubt many Brits would be thrilled about that. And then then and only then can beautiful Germany, and this goes on for 3 or 4 times, and then finally, then and only then can they join the peaceful nations of the world. And then they start rolling the credits, and they have flags flying, and the flags that they were flying were kind of funny. And because it was US, Britain, Soviet Union, and nationalist China, maybe Italy, maybe Greece, and most definitely Norway. Now, for the sake of being... I honestly don't know what I was going with that sentence, but I'm going to name all the things about these peaceful nations that aren't so peaceful. America, we've started occasional wars, maybe guilty of a few others before 1945, and have been guilty of that expansionist bug. Britain, definitely guilty of the expansionist bug, conquered a good portion of the world and held on to it for a good time. Good job. Soviet Union. Do I even need to explain? And nationalist Chinese were known for their extermination of communists. Probably not a good idea to completely wipe out towns, but and I can't name anything about Norway. I don't know about Norway. I'm sorry, Norwegians, or maybe thankful Norwegians that I don't know anything bad about your history. Or good job that you have done nothing as terrible as conquer half the world, or want to conquer half the world and fail doing so. That I can't name it. And that was my rant. Point being, here is Germany. It is a propaganda video with some debatable history and debatable way of playing it. I felt like they were chopping time to fit a narrative. That is really it. This was a rant. If you watched that rant, thank you. Watch our other content, please. It'll hopefully be more sane.